Well, that's really where this question is leading, isn't it? What can governments do? What should governments do? What do we think that, I mean, here we are, the whole European Union. What do we think that governments can do to support freelancers and collaboration among freelancers? I bet Marco has something to say about this.
Well, what I would say is that obviously to pick up on what Hector was saying, I think indeed that we need to move past a sort of narrow debate. And this narrow debate sometimes expands to areas such as employees versus self-employed. I think the right questions we should be asking ourselves really is what enabling environment is needed for people to find multiple and better alternatives than a traditional employment. I mean, I don't think we should lament that some people don't get, some self-employed that don't get full-time benefits. We should reconsider why benefits and securities only come attached to a full-time job. And I mean, the challenge is huge. It involves dramatically redesign the safety net, how we classify workers and companies. It may mean for policy makers to finding ways to fund the portable benefits that would cover workers to piece together freelance job or new forms of insurance that would protect against episodic income. So, I mean, it also, I don't want to get there in a way, but I mean, it also goes into, it may mean allowing independent workers to collectively bargain with the platforms hiring them, or even with a universal basic income. So it's really something that would be used to counteract the insecurity of self-employment and gig work, so that somehow citizens are protected from being citizens rather than employees. So I think people that are skeptical about that are making very unfair comparison between the new forms of work at the moment and today full-time employment, because full-time employment of scale has been around for decades, maybe a century. So we have had really plenty of time to understand the huge imbalances and in bargaining power, but also between the individual and the institutions, and corrected in a wide variety of ways.
I just wanted to say, yeah, one thing we're seeing is, and it goes back to I think there a little bit earlier in this discussion, we were talking about problems with freelancers collaborating also. We see a certain subset of entrepreneurs, and I agree with Hector. I don't want to get too much into details regarding definitions of freelancer versus all of this, but I think we see people who have an idea as entrepreneurs, and they want to achieve their goals, and they want to get the government out of the way. They don't care about it exactly, so we see this. We see people who have ideas and they just want to execute them. So I think Estonia is unique in this way that 99% of services are available online in Estonia, and that's due to Estonia's kind of sparse population. They've had to develop these services for their own citizens where things are online. So 3 years ago, they said, let's let anyone become an e-resident and access these same services. And while Estonia, of course, is a member of the EU and has to work within the same framework, and suffer some, has to work with all the same rules and regulations of that. Estonia is making strides in serving these types of entrepreneurs better and better. And I think one group particularly we see is the so-called digital nomads, or the so-called freelancers who like to travel. Lots of issues were discussed just now about working in your home country and all of the problems with that. Now imagine someone who is a European freelancer who wants to take advantage of the freedom of movement and is moving between countries every 4, 5, 6 months, or more often than that. And that's where we see this group of entrepreneurs and freelancers that are running into even more and more problems. So I think, in Estonia, with e-residency, we're trying to solve that problem where we let people have a hub in Estonia where they can set up their company easily. They can do everything with their digital ID card. And if they need to sign a document, they can do it. If they need to identify themselves online through a platform, they can do it. So I think, governments, if you look at the president of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid, she was just speaking at the World Knowledge Forum in South Korea. about how this model of Social Security for countries, how people paying Social Security only in one country is really breaking down as people begin to move more frequently and become freelancers and digital nomads. So Estonia is just starting to try to help hopefully solve that problem by giving people a platform and a place to have their business and to have a hub for their activities. And many of them, of course, being freelancers.
I think top-down is only one part of the solution. And I think there's already a lot of great examples of bottom-up organizing and collaboration. So one that's very close to my heart is the open source movement, which has existed for 20, 30 years. I think that's really been a force accelerator for not just software development freelancing, but freelancing in general, in that it built up a lot of the tools around freelancing. So, these were a group of independent individuals who made software to do things that they needed done, right? It was scratching an itch. It solved a particular problem. And, there was some corporate sponsorship in various forms as well, which helped. But most of the time, these folks were working remotely, working at home, doing it in their extra hours and so on. So we see a lot of this in the startup movement as well, where the startup movement is organizing the entrepreneur movement. So, government policy, definitely. We need better and more of that, but we also, need more grassroots efforts as well.
Well, what do you think, Brian, about this? Is really interesting to me. There's a movement here in the Netherlands of people who maintain that the government should be required to use open source software. There's an obvious security downside to that for some of the agencies, but certainly not for all of them. And that seems like it's a place where government policy and open source come together. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Like you're preaching and converted here. I'm a big open source fan. I think in general, proprietary source code is not a competitive advantage anymore. And Microsoft this week, I believe, released, I could have the number wrong, but 60,000 software patents, open source software patents. So, if Microsoft are doing that, well then, the world has gone upside down, right? I think open source is now mainstream. It's accepted. It's not the competitive advantage anymore. It's the services you can provide around that and the product you build on top of it. For governments, definitely, greater transparency, lower costs of ownership, and there's a whole bunch of other advantages as well.
Well, that seems to be the spearhead here, is that if you're paying taxpayer money, then there's no real justification for you to be spending taxpayer money on a license for proprietary software when there is equivalent or better software which is open source and free. It has always interested me. So Sarah, we're talking about government policies for freelancers, and you've asked us the question about what is and is not a freelancer, and your model at Smart is really straddles the fence between freelancers and salaried employees. So what policies would you like to see?
Well, as it has already been mentioned here, for us, clearly, if you work and your living depends on the work that you have to do, regardless of the status under which you're working, you should access the same right. You should have access to maternity leave, to sick leave, to paid holidays, and so on. Paternity leave, like the whole thing. But for that, we have to adapt the rules. And what we see, and if I had asked the question of what do you define as a freelancer, is because in our experience and in our research, what we see is that it's not just their salaried workers and their self-employed workers. There's like this gray zone. It goes from, it's all a shading of colors from one to the other. A same job can be performed in very different work arrangements. And you also have there's been also a blurring of boundaries between different legal status, like even within the employee salaried workers, there are a variety of workers and exceptions that are linked to labor law and social protection. And so if we want the issues of the freelancers to be recognized, we also have to look at all this gray zone between the self-employed and the salaried workers. And when I'm talking about salaried workers, I'm also talking about open-ended contract full-time people who are under full-time open-ended contracts that are new ways of work, because these people are doing exactly what we're talking about. Flexible
Yeah.
hours, working from where they want. Only they are salaried workers. So we have to look at the whole image of the labor market, which also allows to see, to take into consideration multi-activity, which has been, or slashers that have already been quoted, and we also, so we should allow different legal statuses, but access to rights should be the same for all workers. Basically, this is what we believe. So there needs to be opening up eligibility criteria to social protection, and more adapted to the evolution of the labor market. This is clearly where we have to go. But it has to be mandatory. And I think that even minimum pay or fees for self-employed workers should be on the table, because this is a big issue.
It certainly is. I mean, it's essentially what we're talking about is a complete shift in how we look at social the social safety net. It is because it has historically been about your work status or your dependent status. Those were sort of the options. And now the question is, you know, what does that mean to be employed? Does it mean you have a boss? Does it mean you have a salary? I mean, that's really sort of that blurring area that we're all dancing in, and you know, the people that we know are all dancing in.